Hello again. This is my fifth and final Lenten Reflection, where we've been talking about this notion of story. We've been considering our own stories, the world's story, and then Jesus' story, and how impactful story is on shaping and changing us and the culture around us. Today we're going to be talking about how Jesus' story and our story and the world's story intersect. We've been using this text from Luke, the 24th chapter, beginning at the 13th verse, which is the walk or the road to Emmaus, where two disciples are walking along after the events of the crucifixion and resurrection, and they're talking about themselves and the world, and Jesus comes alongside. So let's read that before we begin. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place in these last days?" Jesus asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it's now the 3rd day since these things took place, and some women of our group have astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find Jesus' body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they didn't see Jesus." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, Jesus walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. And when he was at table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. This is the gospel of the Lord. Wow, what a story. In my life, I have been on many roads, as I'm sure you have as well. Some of those roads have been joyous and filled full of expectation, full of not only lights at the end of the tunnel, but filled on the pathway with light. But here we are now thinking about light at the end of tunnel for pandemic. Sometimes when we're on that road, when it isn't a joyful journey, we wonder where Jesus is. We wonder if he's hearing us or near. We wonder if there even sometimes is a God who cares. And that's so normal. That's so natural. It struck me in the last several years when I lost people who were dear to me. And I found myself asking that question, are you there, God? And I struggled so hard to find God, to find Jesus, to hear God's voice. I read scriptures. I did everything I could. I prayed with my friends, but I didn't feel his presence. So I finally prayed a prayer that I think will be mine the rest of my life. Probably the most important prayer that I've ever prayed, which came directly from my soul. It goes like this: I can't get to you, Jesus. Get to me. And then I waited. I knew that prayer was an honest prayer, and I couldn't manufacture Jesus' voice or presence. I just waited. In that liminal time, when my story was so chaotic, confusing, and sad, I was helpless. I think those two disciples on the road were in that same situation. They had known that Jesus had died. They'd seen it. They'd heard his promise of resurrection, and they'd heard some tales, but it wasn't theirs yet. And even when he showed up next to them, they were talking about Jesus' life, his ministry, and his death and resurrection as if it were a story out there. It wasn't until they got to the table and started eating together, doing an ordinary thing. Remember, this wasn't communion as we know it. This was a meal, a simple meal. And slowly but surely they began to see his presence. And all the things that they had been hearing about and reading about in the prophets and remembering Jesus' words came to rest in their hearts and in their lives. This is an important place to be, where we wait, where we place our stories out in the open and say these words: God, I can't get to you. Please get to me. And in that time we wait. Jesus doesn't show up like in a flash necessarily. In fact, we don't even recognize him when he does. Sometimes he comes in a friend. Sometimes he comes after we read a simple passage that reaches deep into our hearts. Sometimes he comes as we do something ordinary, like going to communion. We rest assured that Jesus will get to us, that is his story. That is God's story. The whole thing is about God getting to us in our stories. And so I pray at the end of this Lenten series that you think about that you think about the world's story and your story, and that you pray this prayer: Jesus, I can't get to you. Please get to me. And wait for Jesus' story and our stories to intersect. Thanks be to God.